The autumn rain drummed steadily against the tall windows of Dr. Martinez's office on the 16th floor of Northwestern Memorial Hospital, each droplet catching the gray October light and casting dancing shadows across the familiar vinyl chair, where I'd spent so many anxious hours over the past 18 months. The sound was almost musical now, a gentle percussion that seemed to echo the steady rhythm of my heart, a heart that was beating strong and healthy for the first time in what felt like forever. I sat with my hands clasped tightly in my lap, my wedding ring catching the fluorescent light as my fingers nervously twisted together. The ring felt looser than it had 18 months ago. I'd lost nearly 30 pounds during treatment, and despite my recent efforts to regain weight, my body still bore the subtle marks of the battle I'd fought. But those marks felt like badges of honor now, proof that I'd endured something that had tried to destroy me and emerged victorious. After 18 months of chemotherapy that had turned my thick auburn hair into wisps and then nothing at all, radiation treatments that had left burn marks across my chest like a roadmap of survival, and more hospital visits than I could count, this October afternoon in Chicago felt fundamentally different from all the others. The air outside was crisp, with the promise of change, carrying the scent of turning leaves and the first hint of winter's approach. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself the luxury of hope. Real, uncomplicated hope that didn't come with medical disclaimers or cautious optimism. The office itself had become as familiar as my own living room over these many months. Dr. Martinez's diplomas hung in precise rows on the wall behind his desk, interspersed with family photos that showed a man who understood the preciousness of time spent with loved ones. His bookshelf contained medical texts alongside novels and poetry collections, and I'd often wondered during the longest appointments if he read the poetry to other patients facing what I'd faced. The small succulent plant on his windowsill had grown noticeably during my treatment, a tiny symbol of life persisting and thriving even in the sterile environment of a cancer center. I'd memorized every detail of this room during the hours I'd spent here receiving test results, discussing treatment options, and navigating the complex emotions that came with a stage 2 breast cancer diagnosis at 41 years old. Some days, the office had felt like a courtroom where my fate was being decided by forces beyond my control. Other days, it had felt like a sanctuary where Dr. Martinez's gentle expertise and unwavering optimism had kept me anchored to hope when fear threatened to sweep me away entirely. "Sarah," Dr. Martinez said, his voice carrying that particular warmth that had sustained me through the darkest days of my treatment, as he looked up from the manila folder that contained the latest round of test results that would either confirm my greatest hopes or shatter them entirely. His kind brown eyes, which had delivered both devastating news and encouraging updates over these many months, now held something I hadn't seen in them for far too long. Genuine, unqualified joy. My heart hammered against my ribs with such force that I wondered if he could hear it. Beside me, Michael reached for my hand, his palm warm and slightly damp with nervous perspiration against mine. His fingers interlaced with mine in the gesture that had become our silent language of mutual support, the same way he'd held my hand during every chemotherapy session, every radiation appointment, every terrifying moment when the machines hummed, and whirred around my body like mechanical prayers. For a year and a half, Michael had been my unwavering anchor through every storm that cancer had brought into our lives. He'd been there for every treatment, sometimes arriving straight from his accounting firm still wearing his business suit, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up as he settled into the uncomfortable hospital chair beside my treatment bed. He'd held my hand through every needle stick, every IV insertion, every moment when the anti-nausea medication wasn't quite enough, and I'd spent hours with my head over a hospital basin while he rubbed my back and whispered words of encouragement. He'd been there through the sleepless nights when the steroids from chemotherapy had left me wired and anxious at 3 a.m, pacing our house like a caged animal, while he sat on the couch and talked to me about anything and everything. His day at work, memories from our honeymoon in Italy, plans for Emma's upcoming junior year of high school, dreams about what we'd do when this nightmare was finally over. He'd been there when I'd lost my hair in clumps that filled our shower drain, and left me sobbing in front of our bathroom mirror, my scalp pale and vulnerable under the harsh vanity lights. Without hesitation, he'd driven to the pharmacy at midnight to buy the softest scarves he could find, spending an hour on YouTube learning how to tie them in ways that would make me feel beautiful instead of like a patient. He'd been there when the doctors weren't sure about the prognosis in the beginning, when the tumor had been larger than they'd initially thought, and the lymph node involvement had been more extensive than anyone had hoped. During those dark weeks when we'd waited for additional test results that would determine whether I was facing months of treatment or years, he'd researched clinical trials with the dedication of a doctoral student, printing out pages of information and organizing them in color-coded binders that still sat on our kitchen counter. "We did it," Michael whispered into my hair, his voice thick with the kind of raw emotion that comes when relief crashes over you like a wave after months of holding your breath. "We actually did it, sweetheart." The "we" meant everything to me. Cancer had tried to make me feel isolated and alone, but Michael had never let that happen. He'd insisted from the very beginning that this was something we were facing together, something we would fight together, something we would survive together. When well-meaning friends and family members had praised my strength and courage, he'd always been quick to remind them that courage was easier when you weren't facing the battle alone. The drive home through Lincoln Park was a blur of golden, October light filtering through the changing maple and oak trees that lined the familiar streets of our neighborhood. The leaves were at their peak, brilliant reds and oranges and yellows that seemed to glow with their own inner fire against the pewter sky. I'd missed so much of the beauty of the changing seasons during my treatment, spending too many gorgeous days inside hospitals or lying in bed too weak to venture outdoors. But today, every tree seemed like a celebration, every falling leaf like confetti thrown in honor of my survival. Michael drove with the careful attention he'd developed during my treatment months, one hand steady on the wheel while the other held mine across the center console. He'd become such a cautious driver during my illness, hyper-aware of every other car on the road, every potential danger that might threaten our safety when my immune system was compromised. And a simple accident could have meant weeks in the hospital, fighting infection instead of cancer. We talked about everything we'd been forced to put on hold during my treatment, the vacation to Bar Harbor, Maine, that we'd postponed when my diagnosis came just 2 weeks before our planned departure. The kitchen renovation that had stalled when every spare dollar and moment of energy had been redirected toward medical bills and treatment schedules. The possibility of getting that golden retriever puppy that Emma had been lobbying for since she was 12. A dream we'd deferred because I hadn't been physically capable of house training and caring for a young dog. "I can't wait to tell Emma," I said, watching the familiar neighborhood slide past our windows. The corner grocery store where Michael had bought me ginger ale and saltines during my worst nausea days. The small park where I'd taken slow, careful walks on the days when I'd felt strong enough to move my body in the sunshine. The library where I'd spent hours reading during the long stretches between treatments, when I'd been too tired for much else, but not quite sick enough to stay in bed. "She's going to be over the moon," Michael agreed, squeezing my hand with gentle pressure. "We should celebrate tonight. How about I pick up ingredients for your favorite pasta? The one with the sun-dried tomatoes and fresh basil that your sister brought us that recipe for?" The mention of food made my stomach rumble with genuine hunger, not the forced eating of someone trying to maintain strength during chemotherapy, but the real, healthy appetite I hadn't felt in months. I nodded enthusiastically, feeling lighter than I had since before my diagnosis. The simple pleasure of planning a meal based on what I wanted, rather than what my treatment-compromised digestive system could handle, felt revolutionary, like reclaiming a piece of my humanity that cancer had temporarily stolen. Our house on Ashland Avenue looked exactly the same as always as we pulled into the driveway. A modest, 2-story brick home with the cheerful blue shutters I'd painted. 3 summers ago, during a weekend home improvement project, back when the word cancer existed only in other people's vocabularies and not as the central organizing principle of our daily lives, the small front garden that I'd spent years cultivating still showed signs of Michael's careful tending during my illness. He'd learned which flowers needed daily watering and which thrived on neglect, which plants could survive the early autumn frost, and which needed to be covered with old bed sheets when the temperature dropped. But as we walked up the familiar brick pathway, everything felt fundamentally different. This wasn't just the house where I'd been sick for 18 months, where I'd spent countless hours too weak to do much more than rest on the couch and watch cooking shows I was too nauseous to enjoy. This was the house where I'd survived. This was the house where I'd fought the fight of my life and won. Inside, Michael immediately went to the kitchen while I called Emma at her best friend Jessica's house, where she'd been spending the afternoon working on a group project for her AP history class. The familiar chaos of our kitchen welcomed me. The stack of medical appointment cards that had accumulated on our refrigerator. The pill organizer that had become as essential as our coffee maker. The comfortable clutter of a family that had learned to navigate life around the unpredictable demands of serious illness. Her scream of joy when I told her the news made me laugh until my sides hurt. The kind of pure, unguarded laughter that had been rare during the serious months of treatment and recovery. "Mom, oh my God, really? Really, really?" Emma's voice cracked with tears of relief and happiness. At 16, she tried so hard to project the sophisticated maturity that she thought was expected of her. But in moments like this, she was still my little girl. The same child who used to climb into our bed on Sunday mornings and demand pancakes, who still asked me to braid her hair before important events, who had spent the last 18 months trying to be strong for me while dealing with her own terror about losing another parent. "Really, really," I confirmed, using the phrase that had been our private language since she was small, a guarantee that what I was telling her was true and important, and not subject to the kind of adult hedging that children learn to mistrust. "Dr. Martinez says I'm officially in remission. The scans are completely clear. I'm coming home right now. Jessica can finish the project later. We have to celebrate. We have to do something special. We have to—" "Oh my God, Mom. I'm so happy." I can't even think straight. After hanging up, I stood in our living room for a long moment, looking around at the space that had become our battlefield and our sanctuary over these difficult months. Every piece of furniture told a story from my illness. The comfortable, brown leather couch where I'd spent countless hours when walking to the bedroom felt like too much effort, surrounded by pillows and blankets, and the remote controls for streaming services that had become my primary entertainment, when reading required more concentration than I could muster. The bookshelf against the far wall had been transformed during my illness from a collection of novels and coffee table books into a medical supply station. Michael had organized all my medications there with the methodical precision he brought to his accounting work, prescription bottles arranged by dosage, time, over-the-counter supplements lined up in alphabetical order, thermometers and blood pressure cuffs stored in labeled baskets. The organization had been his way of maintaining some sense of control when so much of our lives had been dictated by forces beyond our influence. The soft throw blanket that Emma had given me for Christmas, a luxurious cashmere blend in my favorite shade of deep purple, was still draped over the arm of the couch where it had lived for months. It had become my security blanket during the worst days, soft enough not to irritate my treatment-sensitive skin, warm enough to comfort me during the chills that accompanied some of my medications, and beautiful enough to make me feel human, rather than simply like a patient. On the coffee table sat a stack of books that well-meaning friends had brought me during my treatment. Inspirational memoirs by other cancer survivors, meditation guides, gentle fiction that promised happy endings, and no tragic deaths. I'd appreciated the thoughtfulness, even when I hadn't had the energy or concentration to read more than a few pages at a time. During the worst weeks, even the weight of a paperback book had felt too heavy for my weakened arms to hold for very long. "Penny for your thoughts?" Michael appeared in the doorway, having shed his navy suit jacket and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. Even at 45, he remained handsome in that steady, dependable way that had first attracted me when we'd met at a community college fundraiser 4 years earlier. He'd been volunteering at the registration table, patiently helping confused parents navigate the maze of financial aid paperwork, and I'd been immediately drawn to his calm competence and genuine desire to help. His dark brown hair was showing more silver at the temples now than it had been before my diagnosis, and the lines around his eyes had deepened during my illness. I'd watched him age months in the span of weeks during my most intensive treatments. Seen him develop the permanent, slightly worried expression of someone who'd learned that life could change irrevocably in the time it took to say the words, malignant, tumor. But his smile was still the same one that had made me fall in love with him, warm and genuine, and completely focused on whoever he was looking at, as if they were the most important person in the world at that moment. "Just thinking about how different everything feels," I said, moving to the window that looked out over our small backyard. The oak tree that dominated our lawn was nearly bare now, its branches stark against the gray sky, but I could already imagine how green and full it would be come spring. For the first time in 18 months, I was absolutely certain I would be here to see it bloom again. This morning I was a cancer patient going to what might have been another difficult appointment with uncertain results. Tonight I paused, trying to find the right words. What am I now? A survivor? Someone who used to have cancer? Someone who beat cancer? "You're Sarah," he said simply, coming up behind me and wrapping his arms around my waist, in the gesture that had been our evening ritual, before cancer had made me too sensitive to casual touch, too exhausted for physical affection beyond holding hands. "You're the woman who fought like hell and won. You're the woman who never gave up, even when the doctors weren't entirely certain about your prognosis in those first frightening weeks." I leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing against my back. It felt like coming home to a version of ourselves we'd lost somewhere in the maze of medical appointments and treatment side effects, and the constant low-level anxiety that had become the background noise of our daily lives. "I couldn't have done it without you," I said quietly, covering his hands with mine. "You know that, right? All those nights you slept in that horrible hospital chair that barely reclined, looking like a pretzel in the morning because you refused to go home and sleep in a comfortable bed, while I was stuck with IV tubes and heart monitors. All the times you held my hair back when the nausea was so bad I couldn't even keep water down. All the times you just stayed when staying was the hardest thing you could possibly do. Of course I stayed," he said quietly, his voice carrying the simple certainty that had sustained me through my darkest moments. "I love you, Sarah. That's what love means. Staying when things get difficult. Being there when being there is hard. Choosing each other even when the choice requires sacrifice." Emma burst through the front door 20 minutes later, still wearing her soccer uniform from practice, her blonde ponytail bouncing as she ran straight to me with the uncomplicated joy of a teenager who'd spent too many months being careful around her recovering stepmother. At 16, she was nearly as tall as I was now, but she hugged me with the fierce desperation of a much younger child who'd been terrified of losing someone she loved. "I was so scared," she whispered against my shoulder, her voice muffled by my hair. "I was so scared that one day I'd come home and you'd be back in the hospital, or that the treatment would stop working, or that we'd run out of options. I was so scared I was going to lose you the way I lost Dad." Emma's biological father had died in a car accident when she was 8 years old, a sudden loss that had shaped her understanding of how quickly and randomly terrible things could happen to people you loved. My cancer diagnosis had reawakened all those childhood fears about abandonment and loss, turning a normal teenager's occasional worry about her parents into a daily anxiety about mortality that no child should have to carry. "You didn't lose me," I whispered back, stroking her hair that was so much like my own had been before chemotherapy had taken it away, and regrowth had brought it back in a different texture and a slightly darker shade. "I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere. The doctors say I'm completely healthy now, healthier than I've been in 2 years. Promise?" she asked, pulling back to look at me with eyes that were still bright with unshed tears of relief. "I promise," I said, meaning it with every fiber of my being. "I'm going to be here to embarrass you at graduation and help you pick out a college, and give you advice about boys that you'll completely ignore. I'm going to be here for all of it." That evening, as we sat around our kitchen table eating Michael's homemade pasta with sun-dried tomatoes and fresh basil, sharing stories about the future with the kind of optimistic planning we hadn't dared to indulge in for 18 months. I felt a completeness I hadn't experienced since before my diagnosis. The simple act of eating without nausea, of laughing without the bone-deep exhaustion that had been my constant companion during treatment, of planning tomorrow without the shadow of medical uncertainty hanging over every decision. It felt like a miracle of the most ordinary kind. Emma regaled us with stories from school, complaints about her AP history teacher who assigned essays on weekends, excitement about the winter formal that was still 2 months away, but already requiring intensive planning with her friends. Michael told us about a particularly difficult client whose books had been such a mess that untangling them felt like solving a complex puzzle. But he'd finally figured out where $15,000 had gone missing from their accounts. Normal conversations. Normal problems. Normal life resuming its familiar rhythms after being suspended for what felt like forever. "I want to do something," I announced as Michael cleared the dishes with the domestic efficiency he'd perfected during my illness. Something to mark this day. Something bigger than just having dinner and pretending everything is back to normal. "Like what?" Emma asked, still grinning with the kind of pure happiness that made her look years younger than her 16 years. "Don't know yet. Maybe volunteer at the cancer center to help other patients and families who are just starting this journey. Maybe take that watercolor class I always talked about but never had time for when I was working full-time. Maybe travel. Somewhere I've always wanted to go but never prioritized because there always seemed to be more time for everything later. I felt like I had been given this extraordinary second chance, and I wanted to make it count for something beyond just returning to the routines and obligations that had filled my days before cancer had forced me to reevaluate what actually mattered in life." "You should write," Michael suggested, loading plates into the dishwasher with careful attention to ensuring the water spray would reach every surface. "You always talked about writing that novel you've been thinking about for years. Remember? The one about the woman who inherits a house in Ireland and discovers family secrets." "Maybe," I said, the idea taking root in my imagination, in a way it hadn't been able to when all my mental energy had been focused on medical appointments and treatment side effects. "Maybe I really will finally write something. I feel like I have things to say now that I didn't have before, about what it means to face your own mortality, about how illness changes relationships, about discovering strength you didn't know you had." Later that night, after Emma had gone upstairs to call her friends and share the good news with the dramatic flair that 16-year-olds brought to every significant life event, Michael and I sat together on the couch watching the late evening news. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming. Just a Tuesday night in October, like thousands of others we'd shared over the 4 years we'd been together. Except this one felt precious in a way I'd never fully appreciated before my diagnosis. The news anchors discussed politics and weather, and local crime with the matter-of-fact tone that assumed their viewers would be alive and engaged enough to care about tomorrow's forecast and next week's election. During my treatment, I'd often found myself watching the news with a strange sense of detachment, as if the day-to-day concerns of the healthy world were happening on a different planet from the one I inhabited. But tonight, I found myself genuinely interested in the upcoming mayoral race and the weather forecast that promised a sunny weekend perfect for the kind of outdoor activities I'd been too weak to enjoy for months. "Thank you," I said quietly during a commercial break for prescription medications that promised to solve problems I was grateful I didn't have. For what? For not leaving. For staying when things got scary and uncertain and exhausting. For loving me when I was bald and sick, and not much fun to be around. For never making me feel like my illness was a burden you resented carrying. He tilted my chin up to look at him, his expression serious and tender. "Sarah, you were fighting for your life. You were the strongest, most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, even on your worst days when you could barely lift your head off the pillow. Especially on your worst days, when you kept fighting even though every cell in your body wanted to give up." I kissed him then, soft and grateful, and full of hope for all the tomorrows we'd almost lost. It was the kind of kiss that tasted like promise and possibility, like all the conversations we'd have and places we'd go and experiences we'd share now that we'd been given this unexpected gift of time. I love you too, I whispered against his lips. So much. More than I knew how to express when I was too sick to feel anything beyond gratitude for making it through another day. We went to bed that night, holding each other close. And for the first time in 18 months, I fell asleep without the low-level anxiety that had become my constant companion. I didn't lie awake wondering if this would be one of my last nights in our bed, didn't catalog potential symptoms, or worry about how my body felt compared to the day before. I was going to live. We were going to be okay. The nightmare was finally over. I had no idea that the real nightmare was just beginning, or that the man lying beside me was already planning to break my heart in ways that cancer never could. 3 weeks later, I was standing in our kitchen on a gray November morning, making coffee and humming softly to myself. The mundane pleasure of routine still felt like a gift, waking up without pain, having energy for small tasks, planning meals based on what I wanted rather than what my treatment-ravaged stomach could tolerate. I'd started volunteering at Northwestern, Memorial's cancer center, twice a week, sitting with newly diagnosed patients and their families. There was something powerful about being able to say, "I've been where you are, and look, I'm here. I'm healthy. I made it through." The gratitude in their eyes reminded me daily of how lucky I was. Emma had been practically floating since my remission news. Her grades had improved. She'd rejoined the debate team she'd quit to spend more time at home during my treatment. And she'd even started talking about colleges with renewed enthusiasm. Watching her rediscover her teenage optimism was almost as healing as my own recovery. Michael, though, something had been different about Michael lately. At first, I'd attributed his distance to the adjustment period. For 18 months, our lives had revolved around my treatment schedule, my health crises, my needs. Now that the immediate danger had passed, maybe he was simply figuring out how to be a husband instead of a caregiver. But as the days passed, I noticed things. The way he stayed late at his accounting firm more often, how he'd grown quiet during dinner, responding to Emma's chatter and my stories about volunteering with polite interest rather than genuine engagement, the way he'd started sleeping on his side of the bed, no longer reaching for me in the night. Maybe he's just tired, I told myself, pouring coffee into his favorite mug, the one Emma had made him in art class that said, "World's best stepdad." Maybe we both need time to remember how to be normal. When Michael came downstairs that morning, already dressed for work in his navy suit, I handed him the coffee with a smile. "Thank you," he said. But he didn't meet my eyes. "I was thinking," I said, leaning against the counter, "maybe we could go out this weekend. Just the two of us. We haven't had a real date since..." I trailed off. "Since before my diagnosis. Realized. Nearly 2 years. Maybe," he said, checking his phone. "I might have to work Saturday. Big client deadline coming up. Sunday then? We'll see." There was something in his tone, a flatness that made my chest tighten with an anxiety I hadn't felt since my last scan. I studied his face, looking for signs of the man who'd held my hand through every treatment, who'd researched clinical trials, when my first round of chemo hadn't worked as well as hoped, who'd whispered, "I love you" in hospital corridors at 3 a.m. "Michael, is everything okay?" He finally looked at me then, and what I saw in his eyes made my breath catch. It wasn't illness or exhaustion. It was something far worse. It was the look of a man who was somewhere else entirely, who was going through the motions of being present, while his heart and mind were already gone. "Everything's fine, Sarah. I just have a lot on my mind with work." But I knew it wasn't work. I'd lived with this man for 4 years, been married to him for 2. I knew the difference between work stress and whatever this was. "Okay," I said quietly, not wanting to push. "Not yet." He kissed my forehead before leaving, a brief, dutiful gesture that felt more like goodbye than good morning. That afternoon, I found myself distracted during my volunteer shift. Maria Santos, a 40-year-old mother of 3 who'd just started chemotherapy for breast cancer, was telling me about her fears. But I kept thinking about the distance in Michael's eyes. "Mrs. Coleman?" Maria's voice brought me back to the present. "Are you all right?" "I'm sorry," I said, refocusing on her worried face. "Please, go on. You were talking about how to tell your children about the side effects." But as Maria continued, speaking about her fears for her family, I couldn't shake the feeling that something in my own family was terribly wrong. That evening, Emma had dinner at her friend Chloe's house, leaving Michael and me alone. I'd made his favorite meal, pot roast with mashed potatoes, the comfort food he'd grown up eating at his grandmother's table in Wisconsin. As we ate in relative silence, I gathered the courage to address what I'd been sensing. "Michael, I feel like we need to talk." He looked up from his plate, his expression guarded. "About what?" "About us. About how things have been since I got the all clear from Dr. Martinez." "What do you mean?" "I mean, you seem distant, different. I know the last year and a half has been incredibly hard on both of us, and maybe we need to figure out how to reconnect now that the crisis is over." Michael set down his fork and was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the November wind rattled our windows, and I could hear the neighbor's dog barking in the distance. Normal sounds of a normal evening, but nothing about this conversation felt normal. "Sarah," he said finally, his voice careful and measured, "there's something I need to tell you." The tone of his voice made my stomach drop. It was the same tone Dr. Martinez had used when he'd first explained my diagnosis, gentle but serious, preparing me for something that would change everything. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Michael stood up from the table with deliberate slowness and began pacing to the window that looked out over our backyard, where the bare branches of our oak tree cast skeletal shadows across the lawn in the gathering dusk. His hands were pushed deep into his pockets in a gesture I recognized as his way of preventing himself from fidgeting when he was nervous or uncomfortable. When he turned back to face me, his expression carried the kind of pained resolution that suggested he'd been rehearsing this moment for weeks. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since you went into remission," he said, his voice steady, but strained with the effort of maintaining control. "About our marriage, about our future together, about what I want from my life going forward." "Okay," I said slowly, my heart beginning to race with the anticipation of hearing something I wouldn't be able to unhear. Something that would change everything between us in ways I couldn't predict or control. "The thing is, Sarah, these past 18 months, they changed me in ways I didn't expect and couldn't prepare for. They changed us. They changed what we are together, what our relationship means, what our future looks like. And I've realized that what we had before your diagnosis, what we built together in those first 2 years of marriage, I don't think it's what I want anymore." The words hit me like a physical blow, landing in my chest with the impact of something heavy and sharp that made breathing difficult. I gripped the edge of our dining room table, my knuckles white with the effort of staying upright and present, in a conversation that felt surreal and devastating. "I don't understand," I whispered, my voice barely audible even in the quiet of our dining room. "I want a divorce, Sarah." The 4 words landed in our dining room like a bomb, destroying everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, my future in the span of a single sentence. I stared at him, waiting for him to take it back, to say he was just frightened or confused or going through some kind of delayed stress reaction that could be addressed with counseling or time or patience. But he didn't take it back. He just stood there by our window, watching me with those brown eyes that had once looked at me with such tenderness and devotion, now filled with something that looked disturbingly like relief, as if finally saying these words had lifted a burden he'd been carrying for months. "A divorce," I repeated numbly, the word feeling foreign and impossible in my mouth, like trying to speak a language I'd never learned. "Yes, but Michael, I just beat cancer. We just got our life back. We just celebrated the fact that I'm going to live. that we can finally start planning for the future again. That's exactly it, he interrupted, running his hands through his hair with the frustrated gesture of someone who'd been struggling to find the right words for a long time. We got your life back. But somewhere along the way, I lost mine completely. I felt like I was drowning in the middle of our dining room, like the air had suddenly become too thin to sustain life, like the familiar walls of our home had become foreign and threatening. What are you talking about? We fought this together. We won together. The doctors said my prognosis is excellent. No, Sarah. You fought and you won. And I'm genuinely proud of you for that. Genuinely grateful that you survived and recovered. But I didn't fight alongside you. I just existed in the shadow of your illness. For 18 months, my entire world revolved around your treatment, schedule, your medical needs, your physical and emotional recovery. My job became secondary to your appointments. My friendships disappeared because I didn't have time or energy for anything beyond caregiving. My hobbies, my interests, my personal goals, everything took a backseat to your cancer. His words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last, not because they were cruel, but because they contained enough truth to be devastating. I'd been so focused on my own survival that I'd never fully considered what my illness had cost him, what sacrifices he'd made that he'd never acknowledged or complained about. And now that it's over, he continued, his voice gaining strength as he finally gave voice to feelings he'd apparently been suppressing for months. I realize I don't know who I am anymore when I'm not taking care of you. I don't know what I want from my life when it's not organized around medical appointments and treatment schedules, and managing the emotional needs of someone who's fighting for their life. So we figure it out together, I said desperately, hearing the panic in my own voice. We rebuild together. We remember who we were before all this happened. We discover who we want to be now that we have the luxury of planning for the future. Again, I don't want to remember who we were, he said quietly, and the gentle finality in his voice was somehow more devastating than if he'd shouted. I want to find out who I am on my own, without the weight of our shared trauma, without the responsibility of being the strong one in a relationship where strength was required every single day for 18 months. The cruelty of it took my breath away completely. For 18 months, this man had held my hand through every treatment, had sworn he'd never leave my side, had made promises about in sickness and in health in front of our friends and family. Just 3 years earlier, he'd been my rock, my anchor, my proof that love could survive anything. And now, the moment I was healthy enough to be a true partner again, rather than a patient requiring care, he wanted to walk away. Is there someone else? The question came out as barely a whisper, though some part of me already knew the answer from the way he'd been avoiding eye contact, from the guilt that flickered across his features whenever he looked directly at me. Michael's hesitation lasted only a few seconds, but it was answer enough. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. Yes. The single word shattered what was left of my composure completely. I bent forward in my chair, physically nauseated by the revelation, my hand pressed against my mouth as if I could somehow take back the question that had elicited this devastating response. Not only was my husband leaving me after I'd survived cancer, but he'd been emotionally, and probably physically, unfaithful while I was fighting for my life. The betrayal was so complete, so incomprehensible, that my mind struggled to process it. This was the man who'd researched clinical trials when my initial treatment hadn't been as effective as hoped. This was the man who'd learned to prepare anti-nausea smoothies when I couldn't keep solid food down. This was the man who'd held my hand during every scary moment and promised that we'd face whatever came next together. Who? I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I actually wanted to know. Her name is Jennifer, he said, and I could hear the careful way he spoke her name, as if it was precious to him in ways that my own name apparently no longer was. She's a paralegal at the law firm that handles our corporate accounts. We started talking during one of the late nights when I was staying at the office to avoid... He stopped himself, realizing what he'd been about to admit. To avoid what? To avoid me? I asked, my voice growing stronger with the anger that was beginning. To replace shock and devastation. To avoid the hospital smell that seemed to follow you everywhere during treatment. To avoid watching you suffer when there was nothing I could do to help. To avoid facing the possibility that I might lose you and have to figure out how to raise Emma alone and rebuild my entire life around the reality of being a widower at 45. So instead of dealing with your fear like an adult, instead of getting counseling or joining a support group or talking to me about what you were going through, you started an affair, I said, my voice growing stronger and more furious with each word. Instead of honoring the commitment you made to me, you found someone else to make you feel better about yourself. It wasn't supposed to happen, he said, and for the first time since this conversation had started, he looked genuinely ashamed rather than just resigned. It wasn't planned or intentional. It just developed. And spending time with her made me realize how much of myself I'd given up, how much of my own identity I'd lost in the process of being your caregiver. I stood up from the table, my legs shaky, but my resolve hardening with the fury that was now burning through my chest like fire. Get out. Sarah, get out of this house right now. Go to Jennifer. Go to whoever will listen to you justify abandoning your wife the moment she stops being convenient to care for. It's not like that. It's exactly like that, I shouted, all the grief and rage and disbelief pouring out of me at once like a dam bursting under pressure. For 18 months, you made me believe we were in this together. You made me believe our marriage was strong enough to survive anything life threw at us. You made me believe you loved me enough to honor the promises you made when we got married. I did love you, he said quietly, and the past tense felt like another knife between my ribs. But not enough to stay when staying got difficult. Not enough to work through your own emotional response to my illness instead of running away to someone who didn't remind you of mortality and fear and the reality that life sometimes requires sacrifice. He didn't argue with that assessment because he couldn't. We both knew it was true. As I watched him walk upstairs to pack a bag, his footsteps heavy on the stairs we'd climbed together every night for 4 years, I sank back into my chair and stared at the pot roast growing cold on our table. 3 weeks ago, I'd thought my biggest challenge was learning to live without the constant fear of cancer recurrence. I'd had no idea I'd need to learn to live without the man I'd trusted with my life. The man who'd apparently been planning his exit strategy while I was poisoning my body with chemotherapy in hopes of having a future with him. The sound of his movements upstairs, the opening and closing of drawers, the zip of a suitcase, the quiet efficiency of someone who'd already made peace with this decision, felt like attending the funeral of my own marriage. When he came back downstairs 20 minutes later with his overnight bag and a larger suitcase, I was still sitting at the table, too stunned and devastated to move. "I'll be staying at a hotel tonight," he said, his voice carefully neutral, as if we were discussing business arrangements rather than the complete destruction of our shared life. "We should probably talk about next steps tomorrow." "Next steps," I repeated numbly, the phrase sounding absurd and clinical for something as devastating as the end of a marriage. The house, custody arrangements with Emma, dividing our assets, the logistics of... Stop. I held up my hand, unable to listen to the practical dismantling of our life together when I was still reeling from the emotional devastation of his betrayal. "Just stop talking. I can't hear about logistics right now." He hesitated at the door, shifting his weight from one foot to the other in the nervous gesture I'd learned to recognize over our years together. "Sarah, I want you to know that none of this is about your cancer. You were so brave during treatment, so strong and determined. You're an incredible woman, and what you survived would have broken most people." "Don't," I interrupted, my voice sharp with renewed anger. "Don't you dare try to make this about my strength or my bravery. This is about your weakness. This is about you being too much of a coward to be honest with me when I needed honesty most. This is about you being too selfish to get the help you needed instead of finding someone else to make you feel better about yourself." He flinched at my words but didn't defend himself. Maybe because he knew I was right. Maybe because any defense would have required him to acknowledge the full scope of what he was doing. After he left, closing the front door behind him with the quiet finality of someone who wasn't planning to return, I sat alone in our dining room, surrounded by the remnants of what I'd hoped would be a reconciliation dinner. Outside, the November wind continued its assault on our windows, and I realized that for the second time in 2 years, I was facing a battle I wasn't sure I could survive. But this time, I'd be fighting it completely alone. The next morning, I woke up on the living room couch, still wearing yesterday's clothes. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and consciousness, I forgot what had happened. Then I saw Michael's coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen counter, unwashed and abandoned, and the full weight of the previous evening crashed over me like a wave. Emma's alarm went off upstairs, and I realized I had to pull myself together enough to get her to school without falling apart completely. The last thing my 16-year-old stepdaughter needed was to come downstairs and find me sobbing over her stepfather's betrayal. I quickly washed my face, changed clothes, and was standing at the stove making pancakes when Emma bounded into the kitchen. Her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "Morning, Mom," she said cheerfully, then stopped when she noticed Michael's absence. "Where's Dad?" The casual use of Dad almost broke me. Emma had started calling Michael that about 6 months after we married, and he'd been so proud, so honored, to fill that role in her life. Now I had to figure out how to tell her that the man she'd come to see as a father was walking away from both of us. "He had to leave early for work," I said, focusing intently on flipping pancakes. "Big project deadline." "Oh." Emma grabbed orange juice from the refrigerator. "Hey, are you okay? You look kind of—" "I'm fine, sweetie. Just tired." But Emma had inherited my intuition, along with my stubborn streak. She studied my face with the intensity of a teenager who'd spent the last 18 months watching for signs that something was wrong with the adults in her life. "Mom, what's going on?" I set a plate of pancakes in front of her and sat down across the table, trying to find words that would be honest without being devastating. "Michael and I had a difficult conversation last night. We're going through some things right now." "What kind of things?" "Adult things. Marriage things. Nothing for you to worry about." But even as I said it, I knew Emma deserved better than vague reassurances. If Michael was serious about divorce, and the cold determination in his voice suggested he was, then her life was about to change dramatically too. "Are you getting divorced?" she asked quietly. The direct question caught me off guard. I'd forgotten how perceptive teenagers could be, especially one who'd spent the last year and a half watching her mother fight cancer while trying to maintain some semblance of normal family life. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "Maybe. Michael says he wants to." Emma's face went pale. "Because of the cancer? Because of everything that happened?" "No, sweetheart. This isn't about my illness. This is about other things. But you're okay now. You're in remission. Everything was supposed to go back to normal." The pain in her voice made my chest ache. Emma had put her own teenage life on hold during my treatment, taking on responsibilities no 16-year-old should have to handle. She'd driven me to appointments when Michael couldn't leave work, had learned to do laundry and grocery shopping when I was too weak, had held my hair back when the chemo made me violently ill. She'd been my warrior and my companion through the darkest period of my life. "I know, baby. I thought so too." Emma pushed her pancakes around her plate without eating. "Is he coming back?" "I don't think so." "Ever?" "I don't know." We sat in silence for a moment, both processing the implications. Finally, Emma looked up, at me with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry this is happening." "Oh, Emma." I reached across the table and took her hand. "This is not your fault. None of this is your fault. And whatever happens between Michael and me, that doesn't change how much he loves you." "Does he, though? Because if he loved me, wouldn't he try to work things out instead of just leaving?" It was a fair question, and one I didn't have a good answer for. How do you explain to a teenager that adults sometimes make selfish choices that hurt the people who depend on them? After I dropped Emma at school, I drove aimlessly around Chicago for an hour, trying to figure out what to do next. Eventually, I found myself parked outside my sister Kate's law office in downtown. Kate was 3 years older than me, a successful divorce attorney who'd always been the practical one in our family. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it would be her. Kate's secretary, Mrs. Peterson, waved me into the office immediately. "Sarah, how wonderful to see you looking so healthy. Kate told me about your remission. What fantastic news." "Thank you," I managed, trying to smile. Kate looked up from her desk as I entered her office, and her expression immediately shifted from pleasure to concern. My sister had always been able to read me like a book. "What's wrong?" she asked, standing up and closing the door behind me. "Michael wants a divorce." Kate's eyebrows shot up. "What? When did this happen?" "Last night. He said the cancer fight changed him, made him realize he wants something different from his life. Oh, and there's another woman." "Jesus Christ," Kate muttered, sinking into her chair. "Sit down, tell me everything." I spent the next hour recounting the previous evening's conversation, and Kate listened with the professional attention she brought to all her cases. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, drumming her fingers on her desk. "Okay," she said finally. "First things first. Are you sure you want to fight this? Sometimes it's better to let someone go who doesn't want to be there." "I don't know what I want yet," I admitted. "Yesterday morning I thought we were rebuilding our life together. Now I don't even know who this man is." "That's fair. But Sarah, I have to ask, when did this affair start?" "He said they started talking during the late nights when he was staying at work to avoid coming home to me." Kate frowned. "That suggests it's been going on for a while. Probably months, maybe longer." The thought made me physically ill. "While I was in chemo?" "It's possible. And if that's the case, we need to document everything. In Illinois, adultery doesn't automatically affect property division, but it can influence spousal support and custody arrangements." "Custody? Emma's not even his biological daughter. But he's been her stepfather for 4 years, and he's been acting as her father figure. Courts take that seriously, especially when the child considers him a parent." The complexity of it all was overwhelming. I'd spent so much energy fighting cancer that I'd never imagined I'd need to fight for my family. 2. Kate, can I ask you something as my sister, not as my lawyer? "Of course. How does someone just stop loving you? How does someone who held your hand through cancer decide 3 weeks later that they want out?" Kate's expression softened. "Honey, I don't think he stopped loving you. I think he got scared by how much he did love you. And instead of dealing with that fear like an adult, he found an escape route. That doesn't make it hurt any less. No, it doesn't. But it might help you understand that this isn't really about you or anything you did wrong. This is about Michael's inability to handle the depth of emotion that comes with truly committing to someone through their darkest moments." That afternoon, I drove to Northwestern Memorial Hospital, where I'd spent so many hours over the past 18 months. I needed to be somewhere that reminded me of my own strength, of my ability to survive things that seemed impossible. I found myself in the Cancer Center's family lounge, where I'd first met Dr. Martinez's patient coordinator, Lisa Chen. Lisa was in her early 30s, a social worker who specialized in helping families navigate the emotional challenges of cancer treatment. She'd been a lifeline during my darkest days, always available with practical advice and emotional support. Sarah. Lisa looked up from her paperwork with genuine pleasure. What a nice surprise. How are you feeling? Physically? Great. Emotionally, I sank into one of the comfortable chairs that had become so familiar. That's more complicated. Lisa immediately set aside her work and gave me her full attention. What's going on? I found myself telling the story again, and with each retelling, it became more real and more devastating. Lisa listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions, her professional training evident in how she guided me through the emotional minefield. Sarah, can I share something with you? She said when I finished. This isn't uncommon. What do you mean? Relationship dissolution after a cancer diagnosis or remission. We see it more often than people realize. The stress of a life-threatening illness can reveal cracks in relationships that were already there, or it can create new pressures that some partnerships can't withstand. But Michael was so supportive during treatment. He never missed an appointment, never complained about the disruption to our lives. Sometimes the people who appear most supportive during crisis are actually the ones who are struggling the most internally. They throw themselves into caregiver mode as a way of avoiding their own emotional processing. Then when the crisis passes, they realize they haven't dealt with any of their own feelings. So what was I supposed to do differently? Nothing, Lisa said firmly. Sarah, you were fighting for your life. Your job was to get well, not to manage your husband's emotional reaction to your illness. Then why do I feel like I failed somehow? Because you're human, and because our culture teaches us that when relationships fail, it must be someone's fault. But sometimes people just aren't equipped to handle the reality of in sickness and in health. That's a reflection of their limitations, not yours. Driving home that evening, I thought about what Lisa had said. For 18 months, I'd focused entirely on physical survival, trusting that Michael would handle the emotional survival of our family. I'd never considered that he might not be capable of that responsibility. When I got home, Emma was at the kitchen table doing homework, her textbooks spread across the surface we'd shared so many family dinners on. How was school? I asked, grateful for the normalcy of the question. Okay. Jessica's parents are getting divorced too, she said, without looking up from her math homework. She says the first few months are the hardest, but then it gets easier. I sat down beside her, struck by how matter-of-factly she was processing this information. How are you feeling about everything? Emma set down her pencil and looked at me directly. Honestly, I'm mad at Michael. I thought he was different from my real dad. Emma's biological father had left when she was 2, disappearing so completely that we'd never even tried to pursue child support. Michael's presence in her life had been a gift, a chance for her to experience what having a dedicated father figure felt like. In what way did you think he was different? I thought he was the kind of person who stayed, even when things got hard, especially when things got hard. I thought so too, sweetheart. Are you going to be okay? She asked, and I could hear the worry beneath her calm exterior. Yes, I said, surprised to realize I actually believed it. It's going to be difficult, and it's going to hurt, but we're going to be okay. We've been through worse. The cancer was worse. I considered the question seriously. The cancer was scarier because it threatened my life, but this feels worse because it threatens my faith in people, and that might actually be harder to recover from. Emma nodded thoughtfully. But you will recover from it? Yes, we both will. That night, after Emma went to bed, I sat at my laptop and did something I hadn't done in months. I started writing. Not the novel Michael had suggested, but something more immediate and necessary. I began documenting my story, capturing the details of the past 18 months, the conversations I'd had with Michael, the timeline of his emotional withdrawal. Kate had told me that documentation would be important if the divorce proceeded, but that wasn't why I was writing. I was writing because I needed to make sense of what had happened, to understand how a love story could turn into a betrayal so quickly. As I typed, I realized something important. The story I was telling wasn't just about Michael's failure to honor his commitments. It was also about my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to survive not just cancer, but the devastating discovery that the person I'd trusted most in the world wasn't who I thought he was. I'd beaten cancer. I could beat this too. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was fighting. 2 months later, I was sitting in my lawyer's office. Kate had referred me to her colleague David Martinez, no relation to my oncologist, who specialized in complex divorce cases, reviewing financial documents when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Jennifer. Could we meet for coffee? There are things you should know about Michael. Things that might help you understand what really happened." I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling a familiar surge of the anger that had sustained me through the worst of the divorce proceedings. Jennifer, the paralegal who'd comforted my husband while I was poisoning my body with chemotherapy in hopes of saving my life. "Who is it?" David asked, noticing my distraction. "The other woman wants to meet." David raised his eyebrows. He was in his 50s, with graying temples and the kind of calm professionalism that came from handling messy human situations for decades. "That's unusual. What do you want to do?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell her to go to hell. Part of me is curious about what she could possibly have to say that would help me understand anything. If you do meet with her, don't go alone. Bring Kate or a friend. And don't commit to anything or agree to anything." That evening, I called Kate and told her about Jennifer's message. "Absolutely not," Kate said immediately. "Nothing good can come from that conversation. But what if she knows something? What if there's more to this story than Michael told me? Sarah, you've been doing so well these past 2 months. Don't let this woman drag you backward." Kate was right about my progress. The initial devastation had given way to a focused determination that surprised everyone, including myself. I'd thrown myself into the divorce proceedings with the same methodical approach I'd brought to cancer treatment, researching, asking questions, preparing for every possible outcome. I'd also started seeing Dr. Rebecca Torres, a therapist who specialized in helping people process major life transitions. Dr. Torres had helped me understand that my anger, while painful, was actually a sign of healthy self-preservation. I was finally allowing myself to feel furious about what Michael had done, rather than trying to understand or excuse his behavior. "You have every right to be angry," Dr. Torres had told me during our session the previous week. "For 18 months, you focused all your energy on survival, trusting that your marriage was a safe place to fall, discovering that it wasn't, that your husband was already emotionally checked out while you were fighting for your life. That's a profound betrayal. Your anger is protecting you." Despite Kate's advice, I found myself texting Jennifer back. "Tomorrow, 2 p.m., Starbucks on Lincoln Avenue. I'll bring someone with me." The next afternoon, I walked into the coffee shop with my friend Maria Santos, the woman I'd met during my volunteer work at the cancer center. Maria had become one of my closest confidants over the past few months. Having completed her own chemotherapy treatment, she understood both the physical and emotional toll of cancer in ways that my friends who hadn't experienced it simply couldn't. "Are you sure about this?" Maria asked as we found a table near the window. "No. But I need to know what she has to say." Jennifer arrived exactly on time, and I recognized her immediately from the Facebook photos I'd compulsively searched through during my darkest moments in December. She was younger than me, maybe 32 or 33, with auburn hair and the kind of polished professional appearance that came from working in a law firm. She was also, I noted, with a mixture of resentment and grudging acknowledgement. "Quite beautiful. Sarah?" She approached our table hesitantly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I wasn't sure you would." I wasn't sure I would either, I said, gesturing to the chair across from us. This is my friend Maria. Jennifer sat down, clutching a large coffee cup like a shield. Up close, I could see that she looked nervous, almost scared. Whatever she'd come to tell me was weighing heavily on her. I don't really know how to start this, she said, her voice quieter than I'd expected. Start with the truth, I said bluntly. When did your relationship with my husband begin? Jennifer flinched at the directness of the question. Last March, about a year ago. The timeline hit me like a punch to the stomach. March was when I'd been in the middle of my most intensive chemotherapy treatments, when I'd been at my sickest and most vulnerable. While I was in treatment, I said, not really a question. Yes. But Sarah, you have to understand. It wasn't supposed to happen. It wasn't some grand romance. Then what was it? Jennifer took a shaky breath. Michael was working, late almost every night. He'd come to the office around 7 or 8 in the evening, after spending the day at the hospital with you or taking care of things at home. He looked exhausted, just completely drained. I started staying late too, partly because I had my own caseload to manage, but partly because I felt sorry for him. You felt sorry for him, I repeated flatly. He seemed so alone, even though he was surrounded by people all day. He'd sit in his office with the door open, just staring at his computer screen, not really working. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone with the hospital or with Emma, and he sounded like he was barely holding it together. Maria reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, sensing how difficult this was to hear. So I started bringing him coffee, Jennifer continued, just being friendly, asking how he was doing, and eventually he started talking. About what? About how scared he was, about how he felt helpless watching you suffer and not being able to fix it, about how he was terrified you were going to die and leave him alone with Emma, about how guilty he felt for sometimes wishing he could just run away from all of it. The honesty of it was almost worse than if she'd told me it was pure physical attraction. Michael had shared his deepest fears with this woman while I was fighting for my life, had turned to her for the emotional support he should have been getting from a therapist or a support group or our closest friends. When did it become more than talking? I asked. Jennifer's face crumpled slightly. June. You'd just finished your second round of chemo, and the doctors were talking about radiation. Michael came to the office that night and just broke down, completely fell apart. I found him crying in the conference room at 10 o'clock at night. And you comforted him. I held him while he cried. And then she stopped, unable to continue. Then you kissed him, I finished. Yes. The simple admission hung in the air between us. I could picture it so clearly. My husband, overwhelmed by the fear of losing me, finding solace in the arms of a woman who wasn't bald from chemotherapy, wasn't weak from treatment, wasn't a daily reminder of mortality and suffering. Was it just that once? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No. It became regular. Maybe once or twice a week, usually late at night at the office. Never at his house, never anywhere public. We both knew it was wrong, but it felt like this separate space where he could forget about everything that was happening at home. How romantic, I said dryly. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. Sarah, I know how this sounds. I know what you must think of me. But you have to understand, I never meant for it to become what it became. And Michael, he talked about you constantly. He loved you so much, was so proud of how brave you were, but he was drowning, and I was the only person who could see it. So you decided to sleep with him instead of suggesting he get professional help. I suggested therapy, multiple times. He said he didn't have time, that his only job was to take care of you and Emma. He said he'd deal with his own feelings after you were better. But he never did deal with his feelings, did he? He just used you as an escape until I went into remission, and then he decided he wanted to make the escape permanent. Jennifer nodded miserably. That's exactly what happened. The night you got your remission news, he called me from the hospital parking lot. He was crying again, but this time it was from relief. He said he felt like he could finally breathe again, like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. And you were happy for him, I'm sure. I was. But I was also scared, because I knew that if you were going to be okay, everything between Michael and me would have to end. I told him that night that we needed to stop, that he needed to go home and rebuild his marriage. But he didn't want to. No. He said that being with me had shown him what his life could be like without the constant fear and responsibility. He said he'd forgotten what it felt like to be with someone who wasn't broken. The word hit me like a slap. Broken. Those were his words, not mine, Jennifer said quickly. I told him that was an awful thing to say about his wife. I told him you weren't broken. You were a survivor. But he didn't see it that way. No. He said that every time he looked at you, he saw the hospital rooms and the chemo treatments, and the nights when he thought he was going to lose you. He said he couldn't separate you from the trauma of the illness. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. It was almost worse than if Michael had simply fallen out of love with me. He couldn't see past my cancer to the woman who had fought it and won. I would always be, in his mind, the sick woman he'd had to take care of rather than the strong woman who had survived. Why are you telling me this? I asked finally. Jennifer wiped her eyes with a napkin. Because he's about to marry me. The words knocked the air out of my lungs. What? He proposed last week. He wants to have a wedding in June, right after your divorce is finalized. Maria muttered something, in Spanish that I was pretty sure was not complimentary to Michael's character. And how do you feel about that? I asked, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Terrified, Jennifer said honestly. Sarah, I've spent 10 months being Michael's. Escape from reality. But I've never been his reality. I don't know what happens when the honeymoon phase ends and real life sets in. What happens when I get sick, or when we have problems, or when life gets complicated the way life always does? You're worried he'll run away again. I'm worried that the man I fell in love with doesn't actually exist. That he's just someone Michael pretended to be when he needed to forget about his real life. I stared at this woman who had been the catalyst for the destruction of my marriage, and I realized something unexpected. I felt sorry for her. She'd been used by my husband just as much as I had, just in a different way. Jennifer, why are you really here? What do you want from me? She looked down at her coffee cup. I want to know what Michael was like before the cancer. I want to know if the man who's asking me to marry him is capable of staying when things get difficult, because if he's not, I need to know that before I make the biggest mistake of my life. The irony was almost laughable. The other woman was asking me to vouch for the character of the man who had abandoned me. The Michael I married, I said slowly, was kind and steady and reliable. He was the kind of man who remembered anniversaries and fixed broken faucets and showed up when he said he would. But I also thought he was the kind of man who honored his commitments, who understood what for better or worse meant. And now? Now I think that maybe the Michael I married only existed when life was easy. When things got hard, really hard, he became someone I didn't recognize. Jennifer nodded, looking even more miserable. That's what I was afraid you'd say. Jennifer, can I give you some advice? Please. Don't marry him in June. If you really love him, make him wait. Make him prove that he can handle a real relationship, with real problems, without running away to the next woman who makes him feel better about himself. And if he can't handle the wait, then you'll have your answer about what kind of man he really is. Jennifer left the coffee shop looking thoughtful and troubled, and I found myself feeling lighter than I had in months. Not because I'd hurt her. I took no pleasure in her obvious distress, but because I finally understood what had really happened to my marriage. "That was big of you," Maria said as we walked to our cars, giving her honest advice instead of just telling her what she deserved to hear. I spent too many months wondering what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed as a wife. But hearing her story, Michael didn't leave me because I wasn't good enough. He left because he wasn't strong enough. And now? I looked up at the gray February sky, feeling something I hadn't felt since that October day when Dr. Martinez told me I was in remission. Hope for the future. Now I get to find out who I am when I'm not fighting cancer, and not fighting to save a marriage that was already over. For the first time in 2 years, I get to just be Sarah. 3 months later, I was standing in my newly renovated kitchen. I'd finally finished the project Michael and I had started before my diagnosis, when Emma came home from school with news that made me smile. "Jennifer broke up with Michael," she announced, dropping her backpack by the door. Jessica heard it from her mom, who heard it from someone at the law firm. "Really?" I tried to keep my voice neutral, though I felt a surge of satisfaction. Apparently she gave him back the ring and told him she wasn't ready to get married. Jessica's mom said Michael looked like he'd been hit by a truck. I thought about my conversation with Jennifer 4 months earlier, and I hoped she'd taken my advice to heart. She deserved better than being someone's escape route from reality. "How do you feel about that?" I asked Emma. "Honestly? Good. I know that makes me a terrible person, but I'm glad she figured out what kind of man he is before she married him." Emma had grown up a lot in the past year. The divorce had been finalized in April, and while it had been painful and expensive, it had also been liberating. Michael had been awarded limited visitation with Emma. She was old enough that the court took her preferences into account, and she'd been clear that she wanted minimal contact with him. "You know what this means?" Emma said, grinning at me. "What? You're officially the strongest person I know. You beat cancer, you survived a terrible divorce, and you're still standing. You're like invincible." "I'm not invincible, sweetheart. I'm just stubborn." "Same thing," Emma said, hugging me tightly. That evening, I sat on my back porch with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. My phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Torres. "How are you feeling about the 1 year mark being next week?" Next Tuesday would mark exactly 1 year since Michael had asked for a divorce. A year since my world had imploded just 3 weeks after I'd thought I'd won the battle of my life. I typed back, "Grateful." A year ago, I thought losing Michael was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I realize it was the best thing that could happen to me. It was true. The divorce had forced me to rediscover parts of myself that I'd lost during my marriage, not because Michael was controlling or abusive, but because I'd fallen into the comfortable habit of defining myself in relation to him, his wife, Emma's stepmother, the cancer patient he was caring for. Now I was simply Sarah Coleman, cancer survivor, volunteer, friend, mother figure to an amazing teenager, and for the first time in years, someone with unlimited possibilities ahead of her. I'd started writing, seriously not the novel Michael had suggested, but a memoir about surviving cancer and divorce simultaneously. My agent thought it had real potential to help other women facing similar challenges. I'd also started dating again. Nothing serious. Just rediscovering what it felt like to have conversations with men who saw me as an interesting woman rather than a patient or a burden. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was capable of surviving things I'd never imagined I could survive. Cancer had taught me that my body was stronger than I knew. Michael's betrayal had taught me that my spirit was stronger than I knew. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to the woman I'd been before cancer, to the fighter I'd become during treatment, and to the survivor I was still becoming every single day. I'd beaten cancer. I'd survived betrayal. I'd rebuilt my life from scratch, and I was just getting started.